Good evening, everyone. Today, we group will show you the issue resulting from operating lease. We will introduce these four parts in order, including issue, event, company and benchmarking, and recommendation. The first part is issue. Some problems occurred because of previous standard. According to the old standard IAS 17 under IFRS, classification between finance and operating lease and different accountings were permitted. In terms of finance lease, it should be capitalized as an asset and liability on the balance sheet and recognize depreciation and expense on the income statement. However, for operating lease, it only needed to be recorded in the footnotes of financial statements as off-balance sheet lease item. As for CAS, accounting methods were equivalent to IAS 17. Due to such different accounting treatments, many authorities stated their concerns about this. According to IFRS, the absence of information about lease on the balance sheet means that investors and analysts were not able to properly compare companies that borrow to buy assets with those that lease assets without making the adjustment. In addition, FASB stated that operating lease model has been criticized for failing to meet the needs of users of financial statements because they do not always provide the faithful representation of leasing transactions. Besides, in our textbook, the author stated that the operating lease model has resulted in many abuses. Companies commonly structure lease agreements to make them eligible for operating lease accounting, thereby avoiding having to recognize lease-related debt in their balance sheets. In this sense, use of the operating lease method is the archetypal form of off-balance sheet financing. In conclusion, applying lease accounting requirements based on IAS 17, most leasing transactions were not reported on the company's balance sheet, and therefore these assets and liabilities were not recognized on the balance sheet. Consequently, it was difficult for users to get an accurate view of a company's lease assets and liabilities, and also to estimate the amount of off-balance sheet obligations.
As a response to the concerns regarding the lack of transparency of information about lease obligations, the IASB and the FASB initiated a project to improve the accounting for leases. So both IASB and FASB, they agreed that a lessee should obtain the asset and also a liability at the beginning of a lease. For IASB, they issued IFRS 16 to replace the previous lease standards, and the new one has already taken effective since January 1st, 2019. And FASB also issued a new standard, which is ASC 842, which will take effective on December 15, 2020. So how the new standards differs from the old ones? So under IFRS 16, there's no longer distinction between operation lease and finance lease. And it also states that there's only one single lessee accounting module, and it requires a lessee to regularize assets and also liabilities for all leases with a term of more than 12 months. But they can also choose to expense lease which has less than 12 months lease term. And under Chinese accounting standards, the accounting standards for enterprises number 21 has also made some changes in order to comply with the changes that the IFRS 16 made. So right now the lease standards under CAS is same as IFRS.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a company, China Southern Airlines and China Eastern Airlines, to compare the effect of adopting IFRS 16, the new lease accounting standard. Here you can see under IFRS 16, all of the off-balance sheet leases should be recognized as assets and liabilities. IFRS 16 also changes the nature of expenses related to those leases. It replaces a straight-line operating lease expense for those leases, applying IAS 17 with a depreciation charge for the lease assets included within operating costs and an interest expense on the lease liability included with financial costs. After the adjustment, here is the effect of new lease accounting standard on balance sheet. You can see that the figure in the beginning of 2019 is much different from that in ending of 2018. Secondly is the effect of income statement. New lease rules will result in increase in depreciation expenses and decrease in operating lease expense. Then is the effect on the cash flow statement. The net cash from operating activities will increase because IFRS 16 reduces operating cash outflows with a corresponding increase in financing outflows, which means net cash from financing activities will decrease. After the changes and adjustments, some key financial metrics will also be affected. Current ratio will decrease while debt assets ratio will increase because current lease liabilities increase while current assets do not. But the effect on EPS and ROE will depend on the effect of profit or loss, which depends on the characteristics of the lease portfolio. And then let's move on to the benchmarking company, China Eastern Airlines.
Our group selected China Eastern Airlines as our benchmark. Now let's look at the effect of the IFRS 16 on the balance sheet in details. The table below shows how the company calculated the new lease amount after adoption the new law. Before 2019, there were operating lease of more than 30,000 million RMB was recognized. And the company then subtract those operating leases that were exempted from the new law and then add the old finance lease of more than 70,000 million RMB. Finally, starting from 2019, more than 100,000 million RMB of lease amount was capitalized, which resulted in significant effect on the balance sheet. We can see that the total asset and total liability increase dramatically and the total equity decreases. Now let's look at how the terms in balance sheet changed. Before, the operating lease was off the balance sheet, and the finance lease was recorded under the term PPE. Afterwards, those finance lease was classified from the PPE and combining with the newly identified operating lease. The company then recorded right-of-use assets of more than 130,000 3,000 million RMB, and accordingly, before the obligation of only the finance lease was recorded, afterwards the obligation of finance lease and also operating lease was recognized. Overall, the effect of the new law on the income statement is not so significant. The operating lease expense was no longer exist. Instead, the lease payments are presented as interest recognized as part of finance costs and as depreciation. Because there's no more the lease expense recognized in the income statement, the company's EBITDA increased. Because since 2019, more lease amount was capitalized, so the depreciation recorded within the operating lease increase, which resulted to the increase of net cash flow from operating lease.
and the principal repayment on all lease liability are included within finance activities, and which resulted to the decrease of net cash flow used in financing activities.
So in this part, I will discuss some problems of the new rule implementation and what impact does the new rule have on the airline industry, and finally give a suggest relieving the inadaptation. First, I want to talk about a survey by LeaseQuery. The survey found that only 37% of the company in the early stages of implementation anticipates that their transition would be difficult. However, 67% of companies in the later stages of implementation reported actual difficulty. According to the new survey, both public and private companies are underestimating the challenges of transitioning to the new lease accounting standard. Another survey by Lease Accelerator shows that just over a third of companies think deploying software is an obstacle to implementation process. However, collecting data, which is a problem solvable with software, is the biggest obstacle, with almost 60% of companies reporting that as their stumbling block. While 75% of companies reported more complexity than expected, just over a third has selected a software solution to address the problem. Then I want to talk about the impact of the new lease accounting standard on the airline industry in terms of the financial impact and the business impact. First, the change will lead to higher liability ratio and lower return on assets in the financial statement. So the company need to evaluate the impact on financial indicator and assess the stakeholders' perspectives. Second, the present value of the lease payment is recognized as a lease liability, so the company should reassess the advantages and disadvantages of renting or buying. Third, the new rules require a lot of information that has not previously been gathered, which make companies find it hard to collect data and use the information system. What's more, under the background of the risk exchange rate disturbance, the change of lease accounting standard magnifies the exchange loss, and the sensitivity of exchange rates increases significantly. So the airline industry is expected to reduce the proportion of dollar liabilities. Finally, companies need to change the tax process and controls related to the tax adjustments. Based on the above analysis on the impact of the new rules on airline industry and the difficulties of the implementation, we think that using a new accounting system can relieve the inadaptation of airline industry to the new rules. For example, Bloomberg has added support for the new lease accounting standard under IFRS 16 and also supports the ASC 842 under US GAAP. So this is our reference list. Thank you.